Okay, looking at the Sadducees, and we went through, we looked at all of the things about them, and we brought out a lot of lessons during that. But we're just kind of review a little bit about what kind of people the Sadducees were, and then we're going to ask, can that be us? And as you look at it, you sum it up, they were hypocritical in their actions. You know, they chose what to do and what to disregard. They were wicked. They trusted in genealogies. They were lacking in biblical knowledge. They had a lot of knowledge about traditions and such, but their knowledge, or at least their concern with even the knowledge they had of the true Bible teaching, was kind of void. And then they were dangerous to others because of their teachings. Whenever they tried to make others proselyte, well, if you follow a false teacher, you're going to be following a false way. And then they were prideful. They were self-satisfied with being politically correct, getting along with others if it suited their purpose. And then they were self-serving in that. So you look at that, and like I said, we've discussed this along, whether it be the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. We always ask, is it here today? And if you think about those, how many of those can you see hypocritical in their actions? I mean, how many people look at the Bible and simply choose? You know, what is it they want to do? What is it they want to disregard? Or that's not important. You know, and I don't think any of us, any people who are serious about following God, about being His servants, would ever look and say, well, that's not important. You know, they talked about the weightier matters of the law and such as that versus the others. And Jesus didn't say you don't do these other things. He said, but you do not become hypocritical. Remember, whenever they had the care of their parents, they would sacrifice. They'd say, well, it's dedicated to God, and refuse that. And so he points out that though they were very meticulous in their tithing, they needed to be meticulous in all things. And we can fall into that same attitude whenever we simply say this isn't important. You know, you see it in the denominational world a lot of times. People will look and they will say, well, baptism. You know, I can show you quotes from denominational sources. And a lot of people in denominations don't even know they began that way or they've got those things there. But they'll say, well, you know, in the first century, it was known that in order to be a member of the church, baptism was that avenue that happened. In other words, salvation was brought about by being baptized. But now it's different. Well, I've asked people, what changed? And nothing changed except an attitude towards the Word. And that is the hypocrisy that is there. And then wickedness, of course, wickedness even in the realm of religious places. You know, we talk about, it seems like about every other week or month or something, there's some kind of scandal involving the priesthood in the Catholic Church. And those get the headlines a little bit, but in reality, it's not limited to that. You know, even within the Lord's church, you find so much wickedness that occurs, and sometimes people sweep it under the rug and play like it's not happening and such as that. But the reality is, if it's wicked, it's wicked. It doesn't matter where it comes. And as a matter of fact, if it's within the Lord's church, it's even more so. You know, I know one preacher who's passed from this life now, and I would hate to be in his shoes. But he was known for his strong preaching against moral issues. Well, it turned out that he preached a lot on that, but he also was very unfaithful to his wife during the whole time. And then after he divorced, or she divorced him, then he went and ultimately married somebody else, though he had preached long that people in his situation wouldn't have the right to remarry. Well, people looked and they'd kind of accept it. Well, that isn't there. Well, that was wickedness coupled with hypocrisy. And then the trusting in genealogies, well, that doesn't happen in the Lord's church. We know that. That was a joke. We know that it does happen. How many times do we think we can go by on our family's coattails? You know, one of the sad things, you look in the Bible, and you find women of faith, good, strong Christian women. And it's a sad statement, for example, when you look to Timothy, where here is Lois and Eunice, and the faith that was in them is now in Timothy. Where's his dad? Well, his dad was not a Christian. But how many people do you know today, within the congregation where you are, you've seen it through the years, that there may be women who are steadfast. If you want to really know the answer to a Bible question, you go ask a good, strong, faithful Christian woman. And then here's the husband, and you go ask him about, I really don't have time for that. I'm the breadwinner. I've got to be involved in this. Well, exactly how are you going to stand before God? Well, by implication, he's saying, because I married a good, godly Christian woman. That's the same thing that these of old did. We're of our father Abraham. Well, I'm of my wife Lana, so, she's good for both of us. Doesn't work that way. And it's no wonder then that a lot of times young people are brought up that they are, quote, raised in the church. And I understand where that phrase comes from, but there is no such thing. But you look, and the idea of being in a Christian home does not mean that you are automatically a Christian yourself. That here's the time is right, I'm whatever age you want to set it at, that's when they're supposed to be baptized, so they're baptized. Well, is there any spiritual growth? Is there any walking in the light after that fact? Or is it just we're a Christian family? Well, you look in the scriptures and the judgment of God isn't based upon a family basis. We will each give answer for what we have done. And so it's important for us not to follow after that pattern of trusting in somebody else for my goodness. And actually, one of the phrases, have you ever heard that saying, Jesus plus nothing equals salvation? And we talk about, it's him. I can't do anything to be saved. It's all Jesus. Well, Jesus' sacrifice makes it possible. But I have a responsibility to keep his commandments. That's what a servant does. I have a responsibility to have a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees. I have a responsibility to be an example. But a lot of times we can fall prey to the idea that, I can't do anything to be saved. I'm just going to have to trust in Jesus. Well, that's a step farther than Abraham, but it's still the genealogical idea. I'm a child of God, so it doesn't matter what I do, anything else, because Jesus paid that price, and I'm okay because he's okay. So this idea of genealogy is there, and then lack of biblical knowledge. If you look in the book of Hosea, the 4th chapter, it's plainly stated, that my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. James says in James, the 1st chapter, receive with meekness the engrafted word that is able to save your souls. Well, what does that tell you? If I don't receive it with meekness, I don't get my soul saved. And so I need to realize that I have to have that knowledge. I am called by the gospel, according to Paul. It is the gospel, it is the power of God unto salvation. It is that word that I need to look to know. I'm to do all in his name, that is by his authority, Colossians 3 and verse 17. I'm to speak as the oracles of God, 1 Peter 4 and verse 11. How am I going to do that if I don't know? You find people that they work in a certain area in society. I used to work in the secular realm. Well, there were certain things I had to know how to do. I had to know procedures. I had to know rules. I had to know the guidelines. And if I were to simply sit there and say, well, it doesn't matter, wouldn't have had that job. Well, we understand that. But then we get over in the church, and after all, it's, I'm not a preacher. I'm not an elder. I'm not a Bible class teacher. I'm not a deacon. Well, where does the Bible say that they're the only ones that need knowledge? We need to realize that people are destroyed for lack of knowledge because they don't learn, they don't receive with meekness engrafted word. But there is, of course, the great danger of those who are to be teachers. And that would include very strongly, of course, the elders in our day and time. They are to be able to convict and convince the gainsayers, according to Paul as he wrote Titus. But in the book of Hebrews, the 4th chapter, a lot of people overlook that. The ones who ought to be teachers were, in fact, the ones who failed. And as a result, the people failed to have the knowledge. But this idea of, biblical knowledge, we delegate it. We say that there is no such thing as a clergy system, but then we act like the preacher's the only one who's supposed to know the Bible. And that's total absurdity. I have people all the time that will come up and thank me for lessons, and they say, well, I can always count on you giving a good Bible lesson, that you're going to teach the truth. And I tell them, well, I'm thankful that you're listening, because I expect you to make sure I do teach the truth, to examine those things. I strive to study, to show myself approved unto God. I strive to study so I can preach the Word. But, I realize, I mentioned women. Through the years, I have been so humbled by the knowledge of some of the ladies within the congregation. I mean, true Bible students who, they were ready to give an answer. And it's amazing to see those people. But then there are always, sadly, those who think, well, something I need to know, let me go ask the elders, or let me go ask my preacher. And that's a sad situation to put ourselves in. We are to examine the preacher, the elders, anybody else, to see whether the things they say are so. You can't be noble without striving to be a Bible student, according to Acts 17, verse 11. So the idea of lack of biblical knowledge, it is there. Sometimes you hear people say, well, we've always done it this way. Okay. So what does that got to do with anything? Well, I hope that what we do is right, and we've always done that which is right, but that's not the standard. And then, danger to others because of their teaching. Galatians, the 1st chapter. There were those in verse 6 through 9. I marvel you're so soon removed. Well, he tells them later, he says, you did run well. Who hath bewitched you? And the devotional that, trying to think, was it yesterday? The devotional for tomorrow, if you're looking at those daily devotionals, it'll talk about 1 Corinthians 15:33, the danger of companions that are there. We can be the one who leads others astray, or we can be led astray. And so that is still alive and well. Prideful, well, if you come question me, I'm gonna get you and set you straight. I went to school to be a preacher. I studied Greek. Hadn't done too well on English, but I've studied Greek. I even studied some Hebrew. Who are you to question me? Well, I hope you do question me. And it doesn't matter what school I've been to, what I've studied, how long I've read, how many times I've read the Bible. If I ever get that idea, then I am that prideful individual. But it can be on any of our parts where people come up and we have the idea of, who are you to tell me what to do? James tells us that God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. I want to be given grace, so I look at that. And then self-satisfied with politically correct, getting along. We talked about that whenever we looked at that point, how that some people pride themselves that they can get along with anybody, and how horrible that is, especially since the Lord said, woe unto you when all men speak well of you. I don't want to get along with everybody. I want to be separate. I want to be a light shining in the world of darkness, and darkness and light, they're opposed to each other. If the light is there, the darkness is shoved backwards. And fact is, in the book of John, the 3rd chapter, you find that people wouldn't come to Jesus because they love the darkness rather than the light. And so we need to realize that we can get the danger of trying to get along, trying to be acceptable, instead of trying to seek and save the lost as the Lord and Savior did. And then self-serving and companionship to accomplish selfish goals. That goes on all the time. We're going to fight the good fight of faith. Who are you going to fight it with? Anybody? I'm not. You know, Ephesians 5th chapter and verse 11, you have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Rather you reprove them. Oh, well, that is unless we're going to fight. You know, I don't pick out somebody who is ungodly, who is setting forth those things that will cause the loss of salvation, and yet on this one point, I'll join with them and fight with them. No. The Lord's church, the faithful within the Lord's church, are sufficient to do the bidding that God has given. The Lord's church is sufficient to stand for the truth, to oppose the wrong. And so these things are all there. They're all present today, and we need to stand out as different. Okay, let's go on and look at the priest for just a few minutes here. And if you do not have those notes, if you will email me or text me or anything else, preferably email or text my wife so that I can put her on the spot. But we will make sure to get you the outline. That applies too to the outlines of the Sunday lessons as well. So if you would like to have those and not getting them at this time, let me know. Okay, a priest. Whenever we look at the Bible, we talk about and we ask, what is a priest? And in your notes, I've got, some things there, the New Testament word, what it is, and how it relates to holy. Well, the priests were set apart to the work of God, but really holiness is something that every individual strives for. But in the first century, there was reference to the priest. The Old Testament was another word, and it's in your notes there, but it has to do with divine things. And so priests in the biblical sense, they were the ones who were set apart to do the work of God, to be involved in the holy things, the divine things, the offerings, the sacrifices, and such as that. And so it simply speaks of one who is involved in religious matters according to God's will. Now, there were heathen priests. You find, for example, in Egypt, there were priests and such as that. But we're talking about biblical priests. I'm not going to get into the idea of the ungodly, the heathen priest and such as that. So we're going to study just on the priest of God. Now, you look back, and most people, if you think about priest, they automatically go back to Moses and say, okay, that's when, as the children of God were led out of Egypt, and you have the book of Leviticus, and that deals with the Levitical tribe, the book of priests. You find the book of Numbers and the sacrifice in there as well as Exodus. So, they go there. But actually, you go back before Moses and you find priest. The first mention of priest is in the book of Genesis, the 14th chapter. And here again, the idea of biblical priest. Let me turn back here. Genesis, the 14th chapter and verse 18. Beginning in verse 17, the king of Sodom went out to meet him, and this is Abram, and he had brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods, and the women also, and the people. And it says, the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shibble, which is the kings. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. Well, that's the first time that you find a biblical priest mentioned. Now, whenever you look at that, there is another priest that's mentioned also. Jethro is mentioned in the book of Exodus, that would have been out of what you'd call the Mosaic system, because he, of course, was mentioned before the bringing forth of the priesthood. But here Melchizedek is of, I guess, more particular interest because of the reference to him in the book of Hebrews. Now, when you go to the book of Hebrews, you find where God is setting forth. Here, the Hebrew letter was written to those who were in danger of going back into Judaism, pulling away from that way which God had given. And so the book of Hebrews is a book of better things, and in better priesthood is amongst the things that are spoken of. In the book of Hebrews, the 5th chapter, he says, now every high priest taken from among men is ordained of men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices of sin. And so there you find the high priest reference to. But it gives really the definition that we spoke of about priests being set apart for doing things that are pertaining to God. He says, now they can have compassion on the ignorant, on them who are out of the way, for he himself is compassed with infirmity. By reason thereof ye ought as for people, so also himself to offer for sins. No man taketh this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. So also Christ glorified not himself to be made a high priest, but he said unto him, Thou art my son, today I have begotten thee. In another place he saith, Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. In the days of his flesh, when he'd offer up prayers, supplications, strong crying, and tears unto him that is able to save him from death, was heard, and that he feared. Though he yet a son, he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. Being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him, called a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now, if you look at that, you find several things relating to that in chapter 5 and then again in chapter 7. And Christ is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now, he's put in contrast to the priesthood that was set up as descendants of Aaron. So what you have is that Christ's priesthood, as was Melchizedek's, was not based upon a system of lineage. Christ was a priest because God said he is. This is my son. He is a high priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. Why was Melchizedek a priest? Because God said so. In chapter 7, this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who made Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom Abraham gave a tenth part, first by being in interpretation king of righteousness, and after also the king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth the priest continually. So you look, and again, the Aaronic priesthood that was set in order, that these children of God were being tempted, go back to that system. He says, now Christ is a priest forever, not because of that. As a matter of fact, he'll say later on, he couldn't even be a priest on earth, because he came of the tribe of which God said nothing concerning the priesthood. But he is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a priest, and he did not have father or mother. Well, does that mean that he was just created? No birth? No. That phraseology was common in that time and previous to the New Testament time, in which it means nobody knew the lineage of this person. He didn't have father or mother in the sense that you could go back, well, Melchizedek is a priest because his father was a priest, and his father didn't work that way with Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a priest simply because he had been appointed as a priest, obviously by God. And so he didn't have beginning of days nor end of life. They didn't know when he was born, they didn't know when he died. All they knew, he was a priest. Well, it was just setting apart the sovereign nature, I guess you'd say, in the book of Romans, the 9th chapter, whenever God, through the Apostle Paul, talked about the rejection of the Jewish nation, in Romans, the 9th chapter, it sets forth the fact that God simply said it. You know, how shall thou that are formed reply to him that formed you? You know, how shall the clay say unto the potter? In other words, God has the right to simply state things. He doesn't need our approval. Melchizedek was a priest after that way. So was Jesus. And so that Mosaic priesthood was predated by a priesthood that was there. Obviously, as Abraham met Melchizedek, he recognized him not just as a priest of the land, but a priest of God, because he offered him a tenth. He offered him a tithe to be used for God's work. And then Jethro would have been the same way. In the book of Exodus, the 2nd chapter, he was a priest of Midian. And the Midianites were those who were descendants of Abraham through one of his sons. And so now you find two. And Jethro, some people say that, you know, there's really nothing said. So you have to make some assumptions. But if we're not going to do anything to make assumptions, I'm going to assume that he, like Melchizedek, was a priest after some system that God set forth and named him a priest. But Melchizedek is the one that we focus on because, of course, he is set forth as that pattern that Christ himself followed in his priesthood, having no lineage. And again, just a sideline, those people who talk about Jesus Christ coming back to this earth and establishing his kingdom, you realize that we'd lose a high priest if he ever came back to this earth? Read the book of Hebrews about Jesus in chapter 5 through 7 about the priesthood. If he were on this earth, he couldn't be a priest. We would no longer have a high priest. A lot of other areas that doctrine is fraught with so many things that are error, but that alone tells you we better rethink that idea of him coming back to this earth. Anyway, next week we will start and we will look at the Aaronic priesthood, and that, of course, is the main priesthood that we think of whenever we talk about the biblical priest. But then we will focus more on the priesthood of Christ himself, and then the most important one to us today upon this earth, that is the priesthood of believers. And whenever you think about priest in this world, somebody asks you, do you know a priest? Somebody say, well, down at the Catholic Church or at the Episcopal Church or whatever. Well, I don't know any priests there. I know some people that profess things that are not found in the Word of God, but I know a lot of priests, and they're in the body of Christ, every single individual, and we'll look at that. But thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening, and like I always say, I appreciate any input you may have. I know this is a difficult situation to do that, but you can always feel free to text, write, email, whatever, any questions or comments, and I'll be sure and use them. Now, that class is ended. Last week I got in trouble because I didn't make a real clear demarcation between the class and a little brief devotional, some things to think about. So want to make sure. Tune in next week for the continuation of the study on priests. If you need the outline, contact me and I'll get you one. But today, you look, and my brother wrote me this morning, actually my sister, and she said, oh, y'all are floating away. It says it's raining up there. And I looked, and sure enough, it said it's raining up here. And I wrote her and my brother back, and I said, well, it's supposed to, but then the rain found out the governor said we were to shelter in place, so the rain just stayed in the clouds. Well, that's my opinion of the shelter in place stuff. But anyway, shelter in place. And how, we talk about doing things under difficult circumstances. But whenever I think about shelter in place, I want you to consider this verse as you go through the coming days. In the book of Philippians, and this is one of the epistles that is called the prison epistles, the Apostle Paul, he wrote these words as he closed in the last few verses. Salute every saint in Christ Jesus, the brethren, which are with me, or the brethren which are with me, greet you. And all the saints salute you, chiefly they that are of Caesar's household. The grace of our Lord Christ be with you all. Amen. You go over to the book of Acts and you look, and as you read about the closing part of the book of Acts, how Paul worked and he labored, he taught others the gospel. But you think about Paul, he's in prison. I feel like sometimes I'm in prison. My wife encourages me, she tries to help me, she tries to understand me, but I guess I'm kind of old and set in my ways, and I do not take a lot of things very easily. But as a child of God, it frustrates me that it seems like so many things are working to hinder the work of God. But then I think back to the Apostle Paul and many others. But I look at the Apostle Paul and I think of the studies that have been done on the prison epistles. And those really don't encompass everything that he wrote while in prison. But you think about saints in Caesar's household. You look at the Apostle Paul, and he was shelter in place, a lot worse than what we got. But while there, he wrote others, he comforted others, He converted others. He continued to pray to God. He continued to study. Now, that's just 5 things that I can think of just right off the top of my head. And probably each one of us could think of more. So tomorrow, whenever you wake up and you think about, okay, what am I going to do today? And, you know, I'm limited, other people are limited, and it's just so frustrating. And then you think, you know, let's do what we can. Let's simply work. There are a lot of things can be postponed, a lot of things put off. But the Apostle Paul marked the last few verses of the book of Philippians, the 4th chapter, and especially that, the saints in Caesar's household. How did they get there? The Apostle Paul. You know, I understand the other day there was a young lady baptized out at Chipman Road. And I thought about that whenever I heard that news. And I thought, you know, lots of things happen, shut in and all of that. But it gives everybody a little pause to think about more important things and the things going on in the world. And it's good that there are other individuals there to help them, like the Apostle Paul. So as we go through the coming week, think about what we can do. Don't get like me, have to fight that battle so much about what you can't do. I fight it, and then I go to my wife, and my wife kind of calms me down. But focus more on what you can do, what we can get accomplished as children of God, no matter what the circumstances. Let's all be like the Apostle Paul. And even though we're limited, we're not stopped. Now, as a child of God, I have that opportunity. But also have an opportunity as a child of God to tell any of you who are not children of God, you need to consider that. The Apostle Paul spoke about those saints in Caesar's household, and we've studied saints. We know what a saint is. Saint isn't somebody that some religious group has voted on. A saint is somebody who is set apart to God, and that is by a decision that they make. Romans, the 6th chapter, talks about being baptized into Christ, baptized into his death. That old man of sin is put to death, and we rise to walk in the newness of life. The word saint isn't used, but the word saint is really defined, isn't it? And if that isn't descriptive of your life, why not? And why not now? Whenever Saul became a child of God, Ananias came to him, and he had recognized who Jesus was. He recognized that Jesus had authority. He said, "What will you have me do?" And he was told, you go to a city and be told what you must do. Well, right now, I'm telling you what you must do. Like the certain disciple told Paul, "Why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized. Wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord." And whenever you do that, why not be a Paul and straightway begin doing the things of God? So if we can help you to do that, we want you to know that we are here to help you, to encourage you, to strengthen you in any way we can. So you let us know, and we will do all we can to assist you.